So today, we're going to dive deep into one of the most fascinating debates out there. Were dragons actual creatures that once walked this earth? Let's take a look at the evidence. All right, let's kick things off with round one, where we'll pit the stories people told against the bones they were digging out of the ground. Okay, so the first huge argument from the pro-dragon side is just how consistent the myths are. I mean, think about it. As this quote points out, you have cultures that were totally cut off from each other. We're talking separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, and yet they all came up with stories about these giant reptilian monsters. Believers say that's just too much of a coincidence. It has to be a shared memory of a real animal. But right away, skeptics jump in and say, hold on a second. They argue this so-called universal myth is really just an illusion we've created. See, the word dragon is a Western term. We've basically slapped that label on any big monster myth we find. Their point is, a wise, benevolent, wingless water spirit from China, the Long, is a completely different being from a greedy, fire-breathing, gold-hoarding beast from European lore. They're not the same thing at all. So now let's flip it and look at the skeptic's opening argument. For thousands of years, people have been stumbling across enormous, bizarre-looking bones sticking out of the ground. Now, if you don't have the science of paleontology to explain it, what are you going to think? Skeptics say the most obvious conclusion is that people found dinosaur and other megafauna fossils and just assumed they belonged to giant monsters. And poof, the dragon myth was born. And this timeline from Klagenfurt, Austria, is the perfect real-world example of exactly that. So, in 1335, this massive skull is found. For nearly 500 years, it was proudly displayed as the head of the legendary Lindworm dragon. They even based a statue on it. But then, around 1840, scientists took a look. And turns out, it was the skull of a prehistoric woolly rhinoceros. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast. The pro-dragon side has a really interesting counter here. They say this isn't a case of misinterpretation at all. The word dinosaur, they point out, wasn't even invented until 1842. Before that, what do you think people called the bones of giant reptiles? They called them dragon bones. The argument is that science didn't really discover a new animal, it just gave an old one a new name. And this is where things get really cool. Check out this dinosaur, Dracorex hogwartsia. I mean, its name literally means Dragon King of Hogwarts. You can't make this stuff up. This is a real dinosaur, and its skull looks almost exactly like a classic mythological dragon. Believers look at this and say, see, this is what we're talking about. Ancient people weren't making things up. They were describing the anatomy of creatures they actually saw. Creatures we just happen to call dinosaurs now. So, with the fossil debate pretty much at a stalemate, let's move on to round two. Here, the arguments shift from physical evidence to written accounts and the unbending laws of science. Now, the case for dragons gets a lot stronger when you start looking at what historical figures actually wrote down. And we're not talking about fairy tales here. We're talking about respected historians. Herodotus, the father of history, described flying serpents in Arabia. Alexander the Great's army reported seeing a huge hissing dragon in an Indian cave. Even Marco Polo wrote about giant two-legged serpents in China. These weren't filed under mythology. They were treated as zoological reports. Skeptics, though, just wave these off as travelers' tales. They argue that ancient writers didn't have the same standards of scientific rigor we do today. It's much, much more likely that Marco Polo saw a big crocodile and just spiced up the story to make his adventures sound even crazier. They say these accounts are just describing real animals, with a healthy dose of exaggeration. Okay, now we get to what skeptics pretty much consider their knockout punch: biological impossibility. First up, the six-limb problem. Classic European dragons have 4 legs plus a pair of wings. That's 6 limbs. No vertebrate in the history of Earth has ever had a 6-limbed body plan, ever. Then there's the fire problem. How could an animal possibly generate fuel, ignite it, and not cook itself from the inside out? And finally, the size problem. Thanks to a little thing called the square cube law, flight becomes physically impossible for an animal as huge and heavy as a dragon. The math just doesn't work. But again, the pro-dragon side pushes back. They argue that impossible is a pretty bold word, one that science has had to eat more than a few times. They believe we shouldn't dismiss centuries of accounts just because they don't fit into the box of what we currently know about biology. After all, nature can be pretty darn creative. And they come armed with some pretty cool analogies. Fire breathing? Sounds nuts, right? Well, have you ever heard of the bombardier beetle? This little guy mixes chemicals inside its body to shoot a boiling hot, high-pressure spray at its enemies. Now, it's not fire, sure, but it's a wild biological defense mechanism that sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. And for the lack of six-limbed fossils, they bring up the coelacanth, a fish everyone thought died out with the dinosaurs until we found one just swimming around. Their point is, the fossil record is far from complete. So all of this, it brings us to the real heart of the matter. The Great Dragon Debate isn't actually about giant, scaly monsters. It's really about a much deeper question. What do we accept as evidence in the first place? It really boils down to two totally different standards of truth. On one side, you have the believers, who operate on historical testimony. Their whole premise is that when you have thousands of independent sources from all over the world saying the same thing for centuries, well, that is a powerful form of data. You can't just ignore it. But on the other side, you have the skeptics, who demand empirical evidence. For them, a claim means nothing without physical, testable, repeatable proof. A body, a bone, a strand of DNA. So the real conflict here is whether ancient stories count as data or just stories. So let's really put these standards to the test. If you're someone who believes dragons were real, what kind of evidence would it take to make you change your mind? Well, based on their standard, they'd need solid proof that there's a better explanation for all those stories. For example, if someone could prove that dragon legends only show up in places with really obvious dinosaur fossils, that would strongly support the misinterpretation theory. Or if scientists could discover some kind of deep psychological trigger that just makes isolated human brains invent the exact same monster, that would also be a pretty compelling argument against their position. Okay, now let's turn the tables. For a skeptic, with their super high standard of proof, what would it actually take to get them to say, okay, I was wrong, dragons were real? For them, the bar is, as you can imagine, incredibly high. They would need what the famous astronomer Carl Sagan called extraordinary evidence for an extraordinary claim. We're talking about capturing a live one, or at the very least, finding a unique, high-quality DNA sequence. Short of that, they need an absolutely undeniable fossil. One with a clear six-limbed body and, fossilized fire-breathing organs. Something so weird it couldn't be explained any other way. So when all is said and done, the Great Dragon Debate really leaves us with a huge question. Is it more likely that countless ancient people all saw a real animal that's now gone, or that they all independently invented a similar monster to explain the world around them? It all comes down to this. Who do you trust more? The collective, enduring memory of our ancestors, or the rigorous, ever-changing models of modern science? That's a big one to think about.